Hi, I'm Cornus van der Lucht. Welcome to session 2 of our Global Resource Revolution trainer. In this session, we're going to look at response strategies to the Global Resource Use Challenge, to which you've been introduced in the previous session. So we move on to examining decoupling as a response strategy for your enterprise. And what we will highlight throughout in this course is the necessity to move beyond the traditional focus on mainly capital productivity and labor productivity to zooming in more specifically on efficient use of resources and resource productivity. As we look at decoupling, this takes us to the eureka moment described by John Elkington in his book, The Zero Naughts. Elkington describes a 5-stage process of zero nautics. It's a process that involves the zeropreneur who comes to the realization that the ultimate solution to the problems we are facing is the elimination of waste and full usage of materials. And that eureka moment is the moment experienced, for example, historically by quality entrepreneurs such as Crosby and Deming, coming to the realization that our current way of doing things is fundamentally non-functional and non-effective. Key here as well will be a commitment to continual improvement, not in the sense of incremental improvements, but transformative change, also helping us to avoid the so-called Devon's paradox or the rebound effect. What is decoupling? There is this historical assumption that growth goes along with resource use, and increased growth implies increased use of resources. Scientists working in this field, including the work of the International Resource Panel, makes the distinction between relative decoupling and absolute decoupling, as well as the distinction between resource decoupling and impact decoupling, as you see illustrated on this graphic on the slide. Fundamentally, what we need, if we look at our planetary conditions today, is absolute decoupling. For example, for OECD countries, it is estimated that they need to accomplish at least a factor 5 improvement in resource productivity by 2050. The International Resource Panel also makes a distinction between 3 types of decoupling. At the level of the economy, the first is that of maturation. That is the slow evolutionary process of step-by-step incremental improvements in efficiency. It is the typical stages and phases that economies went through, from an extractive economy to a production, industrial-focused economy to a services economy. The second type of decoupling highlighted by the International Resource Panel is that of burden shifting. And this involves shifting the resource-intensive components of your production processes abroad, exporting your ecological rucksack, so to speak. In the case of business, this could take the form of offshoring or outsourcing. The third type of decoupling highlighted by the International Resource Panel is that of intentional decoupling, leadership decoupling. And this means radical disruptive innovation and radical improvements in resource productivity. While the first 2 options reminds one of the approach of the so-called Kuznets curve, where the assumption is we will grow now and we can clean up the environment later. The third type of decoupling here is what we're really after. And this is the type of decoupling looking at step change to which countries such as Germany and China have committed themselves to take explicitly a leadership role on this. So what does decoupling mean at the level of the enterprise? The concept or the idea of decoupling is really not something radically new to business. Consider the old concept of eco-efficiency as defined under auspices of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in the 1990s. Following a series of expert working groups, partially in preparation for the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, these working groups came up with a definition of eco-efficiency. And if you look at that definition as reflected in slide 6, you will see that it is about producing certain types of goods and services, and at the heart of that definition, while progressively reducing environmental impact and resource intensity of those goods and services. At the time, the WBCSD also defined 7 guidelines for eco-efficiency, and those 7 guidelines today remain equally relevant. If you look at that list of guidelines, for instance, the last 2, the goal of extending product durability and the goal of increasing the service intensity of products, ideas that remain highly relevant today. At the time, the WBCSD also highlighted that eco-efficiency as a concept goes beyond the idea of cleaner production, in the sense that it looks at a full value chain, and that it is really focused on making the link between environmental excellence and business excellence. More recently, the WBCSD had a dialogue with experts and senior executives in over 20 countries and developed a document published under the title Vision 2050. This process involved an exercise of backcasting. The Vision 2050 was published in 2010, and the question was, what would a sustainable world look like by 2050? And then backcasting from that, what is it that we have done to get there? That Vision 2050 lists certain must-haves, and that includes the need to accomplish resource productivity improvements of up to factor 10 by 2050. And with this, the report also highlighted, comes significant market opportunities to the tune of $10 trillion by the year 2050. Again, looking at decoupling at the level of your enterprise, some characteristics of winning solutions defined by the authors of the book The Resource Revolution are the following. The first is that you are challenged to introduce technologies that bring a 50 to 80% resource productivity improvement. So quite a significant resource productivity improvement and a step change expected here. At the same time, the winning solution expects you to introduce that technology with a payback period of no more than 2 years. So this is quite demanding, rolling out new products and services, new technologies with a payback period of 2 years or less. But you may be surprised at the opportunities that exist in exploring these goals. Research by the McKinsey Global Institute, for example, identified the low-hanging fruits, the resource productivity opportunities, for example, a top 15 that exist globally, from building energy efficiency to efficient water use and irrigation in agriculture. And from that, they identified that over 70% of these resource productivity improvement opportunities present an internal rate of return of over 10%. The fifth characteristic of a winning solution, or a level of ambition signaled by the authors Heck and Rogers, is the need to develop a high productivity business model. Now, if you consider those stages of the resource revolution process, the high productivity business model follows the initial phase of technological innovation and precedes the subsequent phase of industrial transition. The fourth level of ambition or characteristic of a winning solution identified by the authors is the need to deliver at industry scale. The argument is that resource productivity really only makes a difference once it is introduced at massive scale. And this is demanding. A common rule of thumb is that a tenfold increase in scale in production brings with it a factor 100 increase in complexity. And the biofuels debate of the last decade has illustrated all the complexities that comes with taking a technology to a massive scale. So some quite demanding levels of ambition highlighted by these authors of the book The Resource Revolution. I invite you to click on the pause button and take a few minutes and think about these 4 levels of ambition that we highlighted in the previous slide, and think which of these are most relevant and attractive to your business in the short, medium and long term. I gave you a few minutes to reflect on this. Now that you've taken a few minutes to reflect on those 4 levels of ambition highlighted and required in a resource revolution transition for your enterprise, let us move on to look at that challenge of introducing resource productive business models. You may be familiar with the business model canvas developed by Osterwalder and his colleagues from Switzerland in publishing the Business Model Innovation book in 2010. That business model canvas includes 9 building blocks, one of which is resources. Now, if you're going to look at the total performance of that new technology or product that you're rolling out into the market, important is to not focus only on that building block, which is resources, but also consider the relevance of other building blocks and the role they play, for example, partnerships with suppliers, as well as customer relationships. And then if you consider the context within which you develop that new innovative business model of yours, that process that you go through in following a Porter 5 Forces type of exercise, thinking of key trends and macroeconomic developments, macroeconomic forces, key in this process is to consider some of the findings of the reports of the International Resource Panel. Osterwalder and his colleagues identified some epicenters of business model innovation that you see reflected in slide 10. The first epicenter of business model innovation is that of a resource-driven business model innovation. And this may be driven by the need for your company to find a substitution in terms of materials used. Also, it could be the addition of a new product or service based on your existing infrastructure. Consider, for example, the case of Amazon that introduced web services based on the infrastructure of its retail infrastructure. And then looking at the other epicenters, we've highlighted their environment-related considerations that apply in all of them, and it goes down to the level of the multiple epicenter-driven business model innovation. An example of which may be your exploration of new approaches to product service systems. Now, taking things to scale, your company, in its ambition to become the resource revolution enterprise, needs to consider 3 things. First of all, you need to make it easier for your consumers to switch. We all know that consumers love their traditional habits. Consumers also love to have various options to choose from. So you need to make it easy for them to switch, and you also need to make the gains on their side highly obvious. The benefits need to be obvious. Secondly, you are challenged to focus on the whole ecosystem. And that means as you plan rolling out this new technology, this new product or service, that you're thinking, for example, of the complete value chain, and that you're sure that necessary resource requirements will be met, and that you have suppliers with the necessary capabilities to support the rollout of that radical resource productivity improvement. Thirdly, you're also challenged, if you wish to take things to scale, to provide committed champions or the leaders from your business. And at stake here is the role of that business leader in articulating a new vision, and also the ability of that business leader to excite people. First of all, to excite your managers, your employees inside the enterprise about your new resource revolution vision. From the resource revolution texts and the related texts that we look at in this course, notably the reports of the International Resource Panel, we see here a call for business leadership. And this includes a recognition by business leaders of some key factors. First of all, business leaders need to recognize the scope of the problem, as highlighted on slide 12. Secondly, business leaders need to show the ability to bring in people with the relevant expertise. And today, more than ever, these will be multidisciplinary teams inside your business. And thirdly, business leaders need to show a willingness to model wherever possible and then test. And this implies making extensive use of computer modeling to be sure how things will play out once you introduce complex processes and systems in the market. Fundamentally behind this is a realization that disruptive innovation requires a radical transformation in consumer mindsets, also a radical transformation in conventional business models, and thirdly, a massive transformation in the performance metrics that we commonly use. Performance metrics that no longer necessarily reflect what to date has been seen as the conditions for success. And if we look at that call for leadership, take for example the case of Unilever and its chief executive Paul Polman. A former chief financial officer at Nestlé, he is no newcomer to various arguments and ways of making the business case. Since he's taken over at Unilever, he's led a process in which the company in 2010 explicitly committed itself to decoupling. This can be found in the Sustainable Living Plan of the company, which includes 3 goals, a strategy with 3 goals. First of all, the aim is, as reflected on slide 13, to double the size of the business, while secondly, reducing its environmental footprint, and thirdly, increasing its positive social impact. Now, the company publishes regular updates on its website on progress it has made with this Sustainable Living Plan and the inherent commitment to decoupling in those goals. And you can detect to what extent, to what level or factor of decoupling it is committed with respect to different resources involved. One thing, as was maybe to be expected and admitted by the CEO, a lesson the company is learning, is the complication of dealing with the full value chain. Consider the fact that over 2/3 of GHG emissions and over half of water use associated with the full life cycle of its products relate to the consumer use phase of its products. So these are lessons the company is learning, and we will track their progress over the years. But important is that upfront commitment by senior executive leadership to decoupling with a longer-term focus in mind. So we come to the end of session 2, and as is the case with all these sessions, we have additional reading materials for you on this online site. And we also have exercises at the end of this session for you to look at. These include a series of questions, some of which we highlight here on this concluding slide. First of all, we challenge you to ask yourself and discuss with your colleagues, what would decoupling imply for your own enterprise? Consider, for example, what are key resources that your enterprise uses most intensively. And finally, we also, among others, challenge you to look at the case of Unilever and updates on its own website on progress made since 2010. Ask yourself and discuss with colleagues, what lessons can you take from the Unilever case for your own enterprise, because there are key lessons here that apply across industries. Thank you for joining session 2, and we look forward to seeing you again in session 3 of our online training.